Hi, I'm Dr. Patrick Gentempo.
And I'm Gretchen Jensen, and we are your co-hosts for Christ Revealed.
I hope you're ready to go on what promises to be an epic journey. Through the production of Christ Revealed, I have to tell you that my own life is transformed, and I witnessed things and experienced things that were absolutely startling. With the wide range of people that we interviewed and the places that we visited, it absolutely changed my life forever. And I can't tell you how excited I am to take you on this journey, to witness these things, and to understand the history, the evidence, and the inspiration of Jesus Christ.
So Patrick, how is this going to work?
Everything is directed toward the idea of the history, the evidence, and the inspiration surrounding Jesus. So every episode in and of itself is extraordinary in its scope, but what's unique about Christ Revealed is that when you put this all together, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I can't tell you how important that concept is. There's so much about Christ that we need to understand. And to take little pieces, of course, can be something that fulfills us. But when you start to paint a vivid and complete picture, it's literally transformative.
So in episode 1, we're going to hear an interview with Sean McDowell. So tell me, Patrick, what was it like talking to Sean McDowell?
Well, Sean McDowell was an incredible interview. Now, his name is well known because his father is Josh McDowell, who is a big leader in the Christian community. Sean is in Christian apologetics, an entire intellectual movement within Christianity that is very compelling, and he has some unique ways, and actually some surprising ways that he leads and teaches his students. So we sat down in his home. He was gracious enough to invite us in and had a very in-depth and powerful conversation that I think you'll find absolutely enlightening.
So lean in and enjoy episode 1.
Sean, thanks so much for spending time with us here today, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Oh, happy to do it. This is a great project.
Can you give us a little bit of your background?
Sure, be happy to. I'm a professor at Biola University, teaching a graduate program in apologetics, which is just offering a defense for what we believe and why we believe it. I also teach high school part-time. I taught high school full-time for 10 years before pursuing a doctorate, and I love working with students, working with young people. So I teach part-time at a Christian high school, and then I get to speak to students and write, and I'm a father and a husband.
Wow. So you have your PhD in what subject?
I got a doctorate in apologetics and worldview studies.
Wow. So explain what that is when they say well, apologetics. Well, go ahead and explain that, but also what you mean by worldview studies.
Sure. Yeah, we had somebody call up to Biola University and say, why do you have classes on apologetics? Why are you apologizing for the faith? Right. Well, of course, that's a misunderstanding what apologetics is. 1 Peter 3:15 says, set apart Christ as Lord in your heart. Always be ready with an answer or a reason for the hope within. Give it with gentleness and with respect. Well, the word translated into English, answer or reason, comes from the Greek apologia, so it's apologetics. So apologetics, especially in the Greek context at that time, meant giving a defense or reason for what you believe. So when Plato wrote a defense of Socrates, he called it an apology. Right. So apologetics, we have classes on why does God allow evil, classes on intelligent design, classes, I teach one on the resurrection or how we know the scriptures are true. And then worldview studies was a little broader that would include cultural issues, philosophy, and just how to apply it to certain issues of the day. That's great. Tell me what you think was meant by the hope within. What I think Peter meant is that as believers, we don't grieve without hope. We don't live in a purposeless, just immaterial world. There's a God who's created us and who's conquered death and evil through the resurrection. And for those of us who believe in him, regardless of the pain and the hurt we see around us, we always have hope that a better day is coming.
And how critical hope is. And this ties into, because one of the things that I feel like through this process I'm discovering is that faith, I think, is an additional human need. You're just given the predicament of being a human being, trying to be one without faith, I think leaves a big void that can lead to all kinds of problems. So do you think those two things are tied together?
Well, I do. I mean, Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment in the law? And he said, love God. And he said, love other people. So we have been made to be in relationship with God and to be in relationship with other people. Now, to be in relationship with God, that requires faith. Now, that's not blind faith.
Right.
That's not believing something without evidence. In fact, I think faith is trusting what we have reason to believe is true.
Right.
But it goes beyond what we can see. It involves a hope in future things such as heaven. So we have good reason to believe in those things, and we trust God, and that's really what gives us hope in the present.
So when you are in classes teaching in the apologetics classes, what are some of the responses you get from students who are coming in to learn in that environment? Are they surprised by the level of intellectual prowess that's attached to all of this?
So we have a very unique program in that it's a graduate program and it's a master's level. So we have people from 25 years old to 75 years old who come in distinctly wanting to study and learn about the evidence.
Right.
So by the time they get into my class, they are sold on the fact that there is evidence, there's facts, they believe it. Really what I find is when I go speak at churches, when I speak on college campuses, there's people who the first time hear about evidence for the resurrection. They hear about evidence from the origin of the universe pointing towards a beginner. They hear about philosophical evidence from a moral law that we know to a moral lawgiver, namely God. So I think the church and the broader culture is pleasantly surprised and intrigued and interested when they're introduced to some of the evidence for God in general and Christianity in particular.
So in the general framework of philosophy and its branches, morality being one of them, most people do not say that, or would not consider that there's a Christian view relative to this that's a well-reasoned view. They almost think like, well, you have to separate yourself from philosophy in order to be a Christian or to think like a Christian. But it seems like the opposite is true.
Well, I think that's the case. We live in a world that says there's truth when it comes to science, there's truth in history, there's truth in mathematics, but when it comes to religion, it's all a matter of opinion, it's a matter of feeling. Whatever you believe is true for you. So without even realizing it, even amongst many believers and non-believers, there's kind of this divorce between facts and evidence and your religious beliefs. What makes Christianity unique is in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, if Jesus is not risen, our faith is in vain. It's worthless. We're still in our sins. In fact, we're to be pitied. So our faith is tied to a single, testable, historical event. So if Jesus did rise, Christianity's true. If he didn't, it's false. So I think for people to start to make that connection and realize that facts matter, evidence matters, and we should use our minds when it comes to faith, that's eye-opening and encouraging for many people, challenging for others.
So over 2,000 years later, are we able to establish some facts that are rational?
I think so. In fact, what's interesting is we would tend to think the further we get away from the time of Christ, the less confidence we can have in the evidence. That would kind of be the natural intuition. Right. I think it's the opposite. I think with increased technology, with increased discipline today, we are actually able to get closer to the very words of Jesus, confidence in the Scripture. We're able to uncover certain archaeological finds we were not aware of in the past. So I actually think the evidence is increasing the further we move away from the events from which Jesus actually lived.
So, and we see that, as you said, there is archaeological evidence that exists, and we're really excited to be going to Israel to start looking at some of this and interviewing these people. It's going to be great. Has there been any contradictory evidence that's come up?
So it depends on what you mean by contradictory evidence. I think there's some evidence that's incomplete, evidence that's ongoing. So when you look at the issue take the topic of archaeology. Most places in the Bible have not been found. Well, that's not to prove they don't exist. That's because most places have not even been excavated in Israel. It's like less than 1%.
Right.
For a lot of political reasons and other reasons. But then of the sites that have been excavated, not 100% of those sites, of that individual site has been excavated. It's a minority of that site. But then of the small amount of sites that have been excavated, very few of those have been studied, conclusions have been drawn, and then released to the public. So we kind of have this expectation that if anything happened, we'd be able to find it very easily, but there's political, there's historical, there's all these professional kind of just factors in the way. So I would say as a whole, what we found broadly supports the Christian worldview. But even in like a court of law, when you have a case, there's always some facts you're just trying to figure out where they fit, even though the broad case might be enough to convict somebody beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right. So, and it's interesting. I didn't realize that less than 1% of it is has been the archaeological digs account for less than 1%, and that there's much more they could be doing. But you think there's barriers in the way of doing that work?
Oh, sure. Some of the barriers can be finances, the money to do it. Some can be safety issues. Barriers can be legal issues, political issues. Personal issues in Israel. If somebody has a home on top of a site, they have vested interest in not losing their home. So there's just a lot of factors that come into play with our ability to excavate particular areas. And sometimes there's uncertainty where exactly cities were, exactly where mountains were. And this is just because we're thousands of years removed from the events. These are the kinds of things we would expect dealing with events from antiquity.
But yet, in your lifetime, there have been discoveries that have been, corroborating, in nature as far as what the discovery was and what was said in the Bible. So, is there any that stand out to you?
There's a number that have been found. One was actually shortly before my lifetime, but one of my favorites was years ago in the Harvard Theological Review. There was a professor who wrote and said there's astonishingly little evidence that the feet of a crucified person was ever pierced by nails. So all of the crucified victims that we found had been crucified with ropes. That seemed to contradict the biblical account, especially in John when Thomas says, I want to see the nail marks in your hands and in your feet. So does the Bible contradict the archaeological record? Well, in 1967, about a decade before I was born, a man who's been named Yehohanan was found in the middle of the 1st century in Palestine, and he was crucified in the way that is described happened to Jesus. Now, there's still some scholarly debate whether or not his legs were actually broken, as it describes in John chapter 19. So that's unconfirmed, but nails were used that shows John accurately described the way crucifixion took place in that place and at that time. So to me, as the archaeological record continues, we just kind of come across these findings that slowly corroborate the biblical story.
And with that, an area of focus for you has been the fate of the apostles. So why did you decide to write on that, and why did that become an area of focus for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I grew up hearing apologetics in the defense of the faith, and one of them was that all the apostles, except probably John, died these grisly deaths because they refused to recant their belief that they had seen the risen Jesus. Therefore, it's true. And there's a power to that. Why would somebody intentionally die for something they knew was false? Well, a few years ago, I was taking a group of students up to Berkeley where we invited in some skeptics to speak to our Christian students. And I teach my students how to ask good questions and just interact with people with very different belief systems.
So, okay, that's fascinating. So you basically say, I'm going to take these students who, we're trying to, they've come here with an agenda to learn, and, we want to shape them. And one of your methodologies in doing that is to put them in front of some skeptics and let them. So you're not afraid of the other side of the argument.
No, these are high school students. In fact, we've had students down to 12 and 13 years
so
old go with us.
Wow, okay.
We'll bring in leading atheists, leading skeptics, leading people from very different worldviews. Now, we train our students very carefully, and we go with them and we debrief afterwards. But I'm not afraid to expose my students to contrary ideas.
I think that's
just got to train them well.
Yeah,
they usually walk away more confident once they've seen the pushback, and then we make sense of it. So we were on this trip, and I had a friend of mine who was arguing. He's what you might call a mythicist, argues Jesus didn't even exist. And one of our students said, well, why would all the apostles die if Jesus didn't exist? And he pushes back. He goes, give me evidence that any of them actually died. And this was about 7 or 8 years ago. My students all look at me like I'm supposed to have the answer. And I sat there and I thought, I don't really know. I've just taken it second, third hand from other people. I've never looked into this myself. And I was in a doctoral program looking for a doctoral thesis topic. So it hit me that night. I'm like, this is perfect. I have to know for myself if this is really a good argument. And I imagine other people are going to be pretty interested too. So that night, I pretty much decided I was going to start writing on that if my committee would approve it.
So what was that journey like once you started making that your doctoral thesis?
Well, when you write a doctoral thesis, I had to be careful not to start off and say, I want to prove that they all died as martyrs to make this argument. There's a temptation to that, and I had to consistently fight back on that because that's the only way to be scholarly objective and be fair to the evidence and really ask, is this a good argument? What's the evidence they died as martyrs? Can we really believe they were eyewitnesses of Jesus? And if this is true, what's the best way to make the argument? So it began by just kind of mentally shifting, rather than just making an apologetic, really asking the question as fairly as I could. And I told my wife, I'm like, I've got to be willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Right. Is this a good argument? So I just started, I literally started by Googling just to see what people were saying. Didn't get much out of that. Then I started doing journal researches. I looked at books. I called scholars. I mean, you just become a detective, and you trace every single footnote you can until you feel like you've exhausted the evidence that's out there, and then you try to assess it as fairly as you can.
And where did it lead you? What were some of the highlights?
Well, some of the highlights, I would say basically, I decided to study the 12 apostles with Matthias instead of Judas, and then James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, because they're such significant figures in the early church, and they're both eyewitnesses of Jesus, and both not believers in Jesus during their lifetime. And I think we can conclude with confidence that at least James, the brother of Jesus, James, the son of Zebedee, Peter, and Paul, we have good historical evidence that they died as martyrs. I think a decent case can be made for Thomas and for Andrew. I think the rest, to be honest with you, it's hard to know when history ends and when legend begins. We just don't know. For example, the story is that Bartholomew was skinned alive. This is the tradition we often hear. Well, the earliest record that I could find is about 500 AD. Now, that doesn't mean it's false. But historically speaking, we can't have much confidence in that being true. Not to mention, when it comes to Bartholomew, there's a number of different traditions about where he went and how he died, about 5, 6, 7 different traditions. So I'm looking at this saying, I don't think historically speaking, we can have a lot of confidence that Bartholomew died that way. So when I ratcheted it back, I said, okay, what really matters here? I said, well, the first thing is we have good, early, consistent evidence that the apostles were eyewitnesses of Jesus. That's why they believed. We see it in all 4 Gospels. We see this distinctly in Paul's writings, like 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We see it in extra-biblical writings. Church fathers like Clement of Rome and Ignatius talking about that. So very early, the consistent record is the apostles saw with their own eyes. Second, we know at the heart of their faith was the resurrection. There is no early Christian faith apart from belief in the resurrection. There's some critics who will say, in the 2nd century, this resurrection begins to emerge, but it wasn't at the heart. Well, this just simply isn't true. The earliest account we have in 1 Corinthians 15, which is at least 2 decades after the death of Jesus. And I think he's passing on a creed that he received earlier, probably within 3 to 5 years of the death of Jesus. Paul says, I pass on you what was most important, that Jesus died, he was buried, he rose on the 3rd day. The early, consistent testimony is that to be a Christian was to believe in the resurrection. I mean, read the book of Acts. When they start proclaiming and preaching the message of Jesus, it's about the resurrection. So the Gospels are eyewitnesses. Second, we know that they were proclaiming the resurrection. Third, we see persecution. I decided to read through the New Testament and pay attention to every single book when either somebody was persecuted or Jesus taught that someone would be persecuted for their faith. I was stunned and partly disappointed how much I had missed this before. At the heart of Jesus' message is pick up your cross and follow me.
Right.
Now, sometimes we say, pick up your cross. My neighbor listens to loud music. My son is disobedient. Well, that's not what he meant. Yeah. He meant pick up your cross and be ready to die. It's over Paul's writing. It's over James' writing. It's in Hebrew, this consistent message. You proclaim Jesus, persecution is coming. But then we see this outside of the church in writings like Tacitus and in Pliny the Younger, that when people proclaim the message of Jesus publicly, they were persecuted. So if we take a step back, what does this tell us? You have a group of people who believe they had seen the risen Jesus. The first thing they proclaim is the resurrection. We have reason to believe that if people were proclaiming the resurrection, persecution was very likely. And then we look at the individual apostles. What do we find? We find some good evidence for Peter. First century evidence that he died as a martyr. Same for Paul. And I think same for both James. So the key is not so much that we can show that all of the apostles died as martyrs. The key is that they sincerely believed that Jesus was risen from the grave and were willing to suffer and die. And that's the key.
And it's compelling. I mean, it's not like a leap of logic that if you can pretty much corroborate that, that at least a handful of them, you can see they did die as martyrs, then it's not unreasonable to suggest that the other ones could have also.
Yeah, I think the key is to argue this. You look in the book of Acts, chapter 4 and 5, the apostles start proclaiming the risen Jesus. Right. They're threatened, they're beaten, they're thrown in prison. We see Stephen killed in the early chapters of Acts. We see James killed in Acts 12 too. And they're told, just stop proclaiming the risen Jesus. In Acts 5, Paul basically says we can't. We fear God more than we fear men. So the earliest record we have is this group of men proclaiming they'd seen the risen Jesus, willing to suffer and die and face persecution for that belief. We have no record any of them recanted, and we know with confidence that at least some of them died as martyrs. Right. So this doesn't prove the resurrection is true, but it tells us they didn't make it up. They were sincere. They didn't invent this false story to get themselves persecuted and to lose everything. They really believed Jesus had risen from the grave and appeared to them.
So with that now, it's a great area of focus to say, let's go deep here and see what does exist in the way of information around this and evidence. What other things about the resurrection do you feel like is very compelling as far as saying that the resurrection is validated?
Well, I think we have to go step by step and look at the facts that we know. So sometimes people start and say, we've got to defend the entire Bible being true, and then you get the resurrection thrown in. Right. Well, I think we can make a case from archaeology, from manuscripts, etc., that the Bible and the New Testament and the Gospels are reliable documents. But we can also say, let's just look at this event, the resurrection, through the lens of how we would look at any event in history. See what facts we know are true, and ask what conclusion best explains it. So there's a few things we know. Did Jesus die? Well, that's unmistakable. We have medical evidence that blood and water came out, that John reports, which only happened, we can medically show at the point of death. We have it multiple attestation in all the Gospels, the writings of Paul, writings of Peter. We even have Josephus and Tacitus, extra biblical writers talking about Jesus dying. So Jesus died on the cross. But then we have this amazing evidence for an empty tomb. One piece of fact being that it was discovered by women. I find this very fascinating. If you're the apostles and you're making up in that culture a story based on a resurrection in which a woman's testimony was not valued as highly as a man's testimony. In fact, the more significant an event was, the less likely they would rely upon a woman. So you're the apostles, and you're inventing a story based upon a historical event. Who's the least likely people you would invent? Well, it's obvious, women. Right. So why do they all report, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that women found the tomb? Because that's what they really believed happened. They weren't inventing this story. Then you have all these cases of appearances. You have appearances of the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15. You have appearances to the apostles. You have appearances again to the women. You have appearances to skeptics like Thomas, James, and Paul. And then you have this transformation of the apostles, willing to suffer and die for this. Tells me they didn't make this up. We have good, consistent early evidence that Jesus rose from the grave. Now, other people might say, okay, here's other theories that can explain the resurrection. Right. And you just Google this, you'll find endless hypotheses. But the question always has to be, given certain facts that we know, what theory best explains all of them right. and has the least problems? So probably the most common one is that the apostles hallucinated. Mm-hmm. Well, one big problem with that is hallucinations are internal subjective feelings. Right. There's not an external object that matches up with them. Well, we have multiple accounts of group appearances of Jesus. I mean, you can no more share hallucination than you can a dream. Right. So hallucinations have a hard time accounting for the facts. It also can't really account for the empty tomb. Mm-hmm. Another common one, which really rocked me in high school, I grew up in a Christian home, and I heard that the Bible is true. I always believed it. And then I heard these skeptics who wrote these articles that said maybe Jesus didn't exist. Maybe Christianity is patterned after these dying and rising gods, Mithras mm-hmm. and Horus and Adonis and Isis from, kind of the ancient world at that time. And there's nothing unique about Christianity. I'd never heard that before. Mm-hmm. And it rocked me intellectually and emotionally to think, what if the story isn't true? When I started to look into it, I realized that there's a few huge problems with this. Number one, the dating is all wrong. Mm-hmm. So some of these stories existed before the time of Christ, but any of the parts of the stories that closely mirror Christianity tend to come from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. Mm. So if there's any borrowing going on, it's from them borrowing from Christianity rather than the other way around. Second, you'll see similar terms, but what they mean by these terms are very different. So last time I looked, it's been a little while, on Wikipedia, it said that Osiris resurrected. Mm-hmm. Well, that sounds like Jesus resurrected, Osiris resurrected. Well, if you read the story of Osiris, he's murdered, thrown into a chest, falls in the bottom of the sea, body is put back together, mm-hmm. and eventually becomes god of the underworld. That's not a resurrection. Mm-hmm. It's the same word, mm-hmm. but it doesn't have the same meaning. Mm-hmm. Besides, these are fictional stories that are patterned after the dying and rising of the seasons, not historical events like we have with the person of Jesus. There's many other naturalistic hypotheses that people put in, but none of them can account for the facts that we know with as much consistency and power as the resurrection.
So what do you think right now is the biggest or some of the bigger misconceptions about Christianity, that non-Christians or the non-Christian world has a certain view of Christianity from the outside, looking from the outside in as compared to from the inside out? What do you think is some of the mischaracterizations that are erroneous?
I think of a few. I think, number one, people look at it and say, well, look at all the bloodshed and the horror and atrocities done in the name of Christ. Mm-hmm. That's a common misconception. Now, certainly some bad things have been done by people who say that they are believers and by the church. I'm not denying that, but that's the lens by which people see all of Christianity. Mm-hmm. They miss, number one, all the good that's been done in the name of Christ, hospitals, universities, orphanages, women's rights, etc. Mm-hmm. And people also fail to distinguish between when people do things that goes against what Jesus taught. Mm-hmm. Clearly they're violating the way Jesus told people to live. So I do think a lot of people look at Christianity through that lens, which I don't think is the whole picture. Mm-hmm. I think another one, people look at Christianity and just think, as with any religion, it's all a matter of faith. Mm-hmm. It's just blind faith. Mm-hmm. Just believe it if it works for you. And they don't realize that Christianity is based upon a testable historical event. Mm-hmm. I think the other one is, a first question in many people's minds today is not so much, is Christianity true, mm-hmm. but is Christianity good? Mm-hmm. I think we live in a culture, given certain moral norms that have been broadly accepted, in particular related to the issue of sexuality. Mm-hmm. Christians are bigoted, they're hateful, they're intolerant. Mm-hmm. So many people won't even consider the evidence because they look at Christians, or at least the perception of Christians that's proclaimed to them. And they think, why would I want to be like that? So they don't even entertain the evidence. Right. Those are three big pushbacks that I tend to see.
And do you feel like they many times are building straw men? There's a bad apple who's proclaimed to be a Christian, but doesn't practice the moral code of Christianity, if you will, but then say, you know, they're held out as the poster child in the media as a straw man, basically, to discredit Christianity.
I do think that happens. A few years ago, I wrote this book answering some of the big objections that the new atheists at this time were raising against Christianity. So I called up one of the largest skeptical groups where I live in Southern California, and I said, hey, I'd be willing to come to your group. I'll give you all a free book and just sit in the hot seat, and you can ask me whatever questions you'd like to ask a Christian. I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers, but maybe we could have a conversation. So I went up there with my pastor and my wife in this home. There were about 20 skeptics, atheists, agnostics that were there, and we had a wonderful conversation. And one thing that stood out to me was how many misconceptions they had about Christians because of a TV show that they saw, because of a comment they heard, because of a classmate. These isolated individual experiences shaped how they saw all of Christians. And one reason was a lot of them didn't know a Christian. Now, in fairness, Christians can do the same thing to other groups. They maybe don't know a Muslim, maybe don't know an atheist. So they have a misconception and see them entirely through that lens. So that's why it's important, whoever's watching this, to say, you know what, let's ask, is my perception of this group, whoever it is, accurate? Do I know people in this group? Do I take the time to listen to them and accurately understand what they believe and why they believe it? So I think you're absolutely right. A lot of people reject a straw man of Christianity, not what Christianity really believes and what Jesus really taught.
Now, this is fascinating to me because I think that is a misconception in and of itself. You've now mentioned it twice with your students and now with yourself, saying that there's a local group of atheists. And I don't think most people would say, well, you know, listen, I'm a Christian, I teach in this arena. Let's have a conversation, right? Most people would say, I don't want to know those people, or they feel like there'd be some kind of a condescending judgment against, you know, these people who are non-Christians and maybe even are trying to discredit Christianity. But instead, you want to show up and actually have the conversation. What was their disposition towards you?
You know what? When I sat down and it started, the head of the group, who's become a friend of mine, he looked at me and he goes, kudos to you. And I said, why? He goes, I can't believe you'd have the guts to just come and sit here in our group and be a part of this. Not many Christians would do this. Now, sadly, he's right. And I'm not saying that to give myself a pat on the back, but most people are not willing to step outside of their comfort zone to meet people. It's easier to label. It's easier to throw bombs on social media from a distance. I had a chance to preach in a mosque about 4 weeks ago. And the imam and I had a conversation. We disagreed, but it was cordial. He was so gracious. They served the best food, Middle Eastern food you could imagine. And we accomplished, we clarified. I think most people today, if you treat them with respect and you see them in person, not just online, are willing to have conversations about faith. I really do.
So this is, I'm startled here, pleasantly startled. So you go from having a interaction with a group of atheists to now preaching in a mosque. Can you give us a little more detail on that experience, what that was like to walk in there and do this?
Well, this was a unique experience. I was working with a group in the inner city in Philadelphia, and we were taking students out to have conversations with people in the city, just with very different beliefs. And I knew I was taking a group of students into a mosque. And in the morning when we were debriefing to get ready, the fellow on our side who's leading it, he says, and you'll be preaching for 15 minutes in a mosque, sharing the Christian view of salvation. I said, okay, time out. I didn't get that memo. Like, I'm happy to do it. That's awesome. But I need to know, like, what are they expecting? How long do I have? What do you mean present the Christian view of salvation? So I prepared that day. I went in and I was asked to give there's probably 150 of our students, maybe 100 and 150 Muslims from the mosque in an open room, and they had food in the back. And I was allowed to present the Christian view of salvation 15 minutes. The imam presented the Muslim view of salvation 15 minutes. And then we sat there and took questions back and forth. And I'll tell you, this imam was so gracious. He was kind, he was warm, so hospitable. We differed, so he didn't pretend we didn't differ, but I walked away. I mean, our students loved it. And I walked away going, wow, man, I think a lot of people, not everybody, there's some people out there that wouldn't, but there's a lot of people, if you just step outside of your comfort zone, treat them the way you'd want to be treated, would be willing to have spiritual conversations. And the best part is I realized some of our students had faulty views about Islam. And based on many of their questions, I realized so many of them didn't even understand the gospel.
Wow.
They didn't get it. They had a straw man view of it. Now, I haven't heard that any of them became Christians, but at least they understand more clearly who Jesus claimed to be, what it means to be a Christian, and I think they felt loved by Christians.
If you watch the news and world political events, you would think that that was what you just described is a impossibility, and that there is no way for there to be conversation, communication, a shared spiritual experience, and which creates understanding. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean alignment, that suddenly people's minds are changed about their faith, but it creates understanding, which can only lead to a positive place. It can't lead to a bad place.
Oh my goodness, only good came out of it. Our students were, they were beaming that night. We went back and we debriefed for an hour and a half, and when the whole trip was done, that was their highlight.
I could see why, and I'm sitting here almost giddy thinking about the prospect of that happening, and I think probably it dispels a certain, maybe a somewhat unconscious view, or maybe for some people it's a overt sense that with people who practice religion, whether it be Islam, whether it be Christianity, that there's a certain arrogance that comes along with it that would eliminate the possibility of a gathering such as what you just described. But instead of arrogance, it's just basically saying, hey, it shows confidence, saying we can walk into any scenario, have a conversation, let there be a level of connection, human to human, and if we don't agree on certain things, that's okay. At least now maybe you understand me and I understand you.
I think the word you said is very interesting, a confidence.
Yes.
Why would somebody go into a mosque or any other religious faith, present their view, and have questions fired at them for an hour?
Right.
It's because they're confident that their position is true.
Right.
One of the things I do in churches is I do this atheist role play. I call it an atheist encounter, where they know I'm a Christian.
Right.
I put glasses on, I go into atheist mode, and I'll give an atheist viewpoint 5 or 6 minutes, and then I take questions from the audience. And then I just kind of shoot it down one by one. And always the frustration brews about 25, 30 minutes into it. I've been called names, I've been personally attacked. And then I'll stop and I'll say, before we answer some of these questions, I want to know, how did you treat me? And I'm telling you, it's like people go, oh, shoot.
Right.
I didn't even realize that. I was trying to win you in an argument. I was trying to show that you were wrong. I was trying to show how smart I am. I wasn't interested in learning and really treating you in love as a human being. And then I'll ask the audience, and I've thought about this. I've done this, I don't know if I'd say hundreds of times, but dozens and dozens of times to youth pastors, to parents, to school teachers, to junior high students, stadiums of 6,000 to 12 students. And consistently students get defensive. Christians get defensive, angry, and sometimes even hostile a little bit. Why? You know why? Because we don't know what we believe and why. We don't have the confidence that it's really true.
Right.
So when someone starts pressing us and asking us tough questions, how do you know the Bible's true? Why does God allow evil? Can't all religions be true? What about evolution? If we haven't thought about it and someone presses us, it's human instinct to get defensive.
Right.
But Jesus said, love God with your heart and with your soul and with your mind. Peter said, be ready with an answer. When we take the time to know as Christians what we believe and why we believe it, it builds tremendous confidence and a willingness to engage people lovingly and thoughtfully with very different views than our own.
So non-believers are not the enemy, which is probably, I think, the mindset. And it's interesting because when I really think about what you're saying relative to the confidence, being the thing that allows you to lighten up and walk into a circumstance and just feel I'm here and I have the confidence to be able to have this communication, not worried that somehow it might rock my world or destabilize my experience of life, but rather that there's a way maybe to gain greater understanding here. I would say that from people outside looking in, I think if they were to be asked, the non-Christian world, would Christians, do they feel like non-believers are the enemy and that that they can't be interacted with? It's really not that way.
I don't think it's just Christians. I think we live in a divisive, argumentative culture.
Yeah.
It's us versus them. And I think there's reasons for this. One reason is I think there's a lot of brokenness and hurt in relationships. We've seen suicide and depression rising. Rick Warren famously said, hurt people hurt people. So whatever your faith is, or no faith, if there's emotional and relational brokenness, then it's much easier to argue with someone and dehumanize them than to listen to them and treat them humanely. I think we also just live in a culture that's so rushed. We're so busy and we're so distracted. And we also are so afraid of political correctness that what if I say the wrong thing? I'm going to get attacked and shamed. Right. So people are afraid in relationship publicly to say stuff. So they go online under a pseudonym, just start attacking people because they have no natural outlet for it. So I found just learning to listen, learning to know what we believe, having conversations, trying to have sympathy and thinking, okay, people with different belief systems aren't the enemy. In fact, they might be right. And if they're right, I should believe it. I mean, I grew up in a Christian home, and my father, I mean, he's been in ministry over 50 years, and he's written over 150 books.
Wow.
He's probably spoken to more young people live than anybody in history. Wow. Done 250 debates. I only mention this because I went through a period of doubt in my life where I had a lot of questions. And I started thinking, all right, I know my parents mean well, but what if I was raised in a different family? If I was raised in a Muslim family, would I just be a Muslim? How do I really know the Bible's true? How do I really know Jesus rose from the grave? And it was kind of an existential, mild crisis. I don't want to overstate it for me. And I remember sitting down with my dad, not knowing how he's going to respond. He spent his whole life defending and proclaiming the truth of Christianity. His son's like, yeah, I don't know if I buy this. So I sat down and said, Dad, I want to tell you something. I want to know what's true, but I don't know that I'm convinced Christianity's true. I felt like I had to be honest with him. He looks at me, he goes, son, I think that's great. And I remember thinking, Dad, did you hear anything that I just said? He goes, look, I didn't raise you to just believe something because I told you. I raised you to follow after truth and to seek after truth. And wherever it leads you, embrace it. He said, I'm convinced if you really seek after truth, you'll end up or continue believing in Jesus because Jesus is the truth. But follow truth, even if you don't like it, even if it's uncomfortable. Seek after truth. That's something my dad has just hammered into me. And he always tells me, even in politics, read both sides before you make up your mind. Right. And I think the only reason we look at people as enemies, the only reason we don't listen more and we get so angry is because we hear one side of the argument. We think everybody else is stupid. Well, if you only look at one side, then of course everyone else seems stupid. Right. But if you read both sides, if you take the time to listen to people, at least understand where they're coming from, then it's much harder to be in this argumentative, he's the enemy, rather than just loving people in the way that Jesus said we're supposed to love people.
Well, and there's so much, as you're citing, the level of acrimony in the world and polarization is unprecedented, at least in my lifetime, I think. And I think everything you just said speaks to the root of that and why that exists. So it's, and I think the solution is, basically creating understanding. And I think sometimes it's the inward look, right? Saying, okay, where am I? And I think it's an amazing reflection given that you're born in a Christian household. Your father, is such a large figure in the Christian community, and that you would still ask the question, and this is really, I think, a startling question. What if I was born in a Muslim household? What might have happened? And all of a sudden you can start to say, okay, and there are people who are. And now how should I relate to them? And I just think that that's an amazing lens to look through that would cause pause for anybody, because maybe the Muslim, if they said, what if I was born in a Christian household? You see? It really, I think everybody can ask that question. I think that's one of the most amazing soul-searching questions I've heard. So I just wanted to point that out.
Well, at least minimally, it can help us be sympathetic to people who see the world differently and be a little bit more self-critical about what we believe and why we believe it.
So now, you're a father, 3 children, and you talked about your experience growing up as the son. Now, what's it like for you being the father?
That's a great question. I love being a dad, have 3 kids, and spending time with my kids is, up there with my wife, kind of my pride and joy, some of the most fun things I do. And, we live in a world where there's a lot of different beliefs, and obviously I want my kids to be Christians. I want to embrace the belief system that we have. I'd be lying if I said differently. Right. But I also know that my kids need to grow up and make some decisions for themselves. I can pray for them. I can guide them. I can hopefully model for them what it means to be a Christian. And at some point, they're going to have to decide what they believe and go for it.
Right.
But, they know I'm going to love them no matter what. So I just try to, when we go on these trips I've been describing, we take my son with me. My daughter was there. When we were at the mosque, I wanted her to meet some people who are Muslims and just have a cross-cultural experience, and not just view them through the lens of which, maybe we see on TV in a movie or the news or something like that. So I try to guide my kids, try to have conversations with them, pray for them. It's fun to be a dad.
Yeah.
But, when it's all said and done, they're going to have to make some decisions about their life spiritually, and I can't make those decisions for them.
So what's interesting, I think, in part, is that, okay, you're born in a Christian household, and you've committed your career and life and faith and spirit to this. What about the parents that are Christian, but their entire life and career is wrapped up in something very independent of Christianity? Whatever their job might be in any type of a company, maybe in a blue-collar world, or maybe they're professionals or what have you, and they haven't had the, I guess I could say, the experience of getting deeply academic into being able to build their confidence based on a lot of education and reasoning that's gone on, yet they want to still live the Christian life, have a Christian household, etc. What are the resources, or what do you think are their challenges and solutions in that particular scenario?
Yeah, I'd say a few things. I'd say parents don't have to be the experts on everything. I'm not the expert on plenty of things in my life. The other thing I would say is, if you just take the time to read a couple books and make loving God with your mind a part of who you are, you've already set yourself apart from most people in the culture who don't read thoughtful books. Right. So I would say to those parents, I'd say, what does it look like in your life and in your family to make just loving God with your mind and thinking Christianly one spiritual discipline? Right. What book can I read? What conference can I go to? Who can I find in my church, track them down and have a conversation with that person and start to learn and grow in that aspect of my life? The other thing, though, is part of being a Protestant Christian is I don't believe there's sacred and then secular vocations. It's not like what I do is more spiritual than someone who's a doctor, a teacher, a plumber, or a car mechanic. As I look scripturally, it was Abraham Kuyper who said, there's not a square inch of creation out of which God does not cry out, it's mine. So whatever profession you have, what does it look like to love God and honor God and serve God through that profession? That's a question that we need to be asking. Now, sadly, a lot of Christians don't ask this question. I met two mechanical engineers who had been in church their entire lives, and they were in their 30s. And I said, what does it look like distinctly to be a Christian mechanical engineer? How do you apply your faith to your profession? They looked at each other, they looked at me, and they said, I don't know, we haven't thought about that. And I thought, what a shame. So their spiritual life is Wednesday night Bible study, Sunday morning at church, but they're not actively thinking through what it means to be a Christian, to live out their profession in the workplace.
So it becomes compartmentalized.
It absolutely becomes compartmentalized.
And that, I guess this is a very interesting point, because they're trying to mechanize their Christianity or their faith as compared to it being a spiritual experience that's a part of every aspect of their life. So, so in a sense, and I guess that can get frustrating, right? I mean, if there's people who are living sort of this compartmentalized or mechanistic faith, they're going to probably be frustrated with what their experience is as compared to saying there's a I have one view that applies to all the important categories of my life. My parenting, my health and fitness, my career, my finances. I mean, everybody's got all these important categories of life, but if you compartmentalize the spiritual side, is what I'm hearing, and kind of separate it from everything else, you're still not really having the experience.
I think that's right. Deuteronomy 6:4, which is arguably the central passage of the Old Testament. When Jesus is asked, what's the greatest commandment? He cites the Shema, this passage, love God with your heart, your soul, your mind, and with your strength. And then he says, talk these to your kids. This is Deuteronomy 6:4 in the verses that are following by Moses. He says, talk to them when you wake up in the morning, when you lie down at night, when you walk along the road. In other words, what Moses is saying is make God a natural part of the rhythm of your life. Yeah. Refuse to compartmentalize spiritual things to Sunday morning and Wednesday night, but our spiritual beliefs should shape the way we look at culture, shape the way we compete in sports, shape the way we have a relationship, shape the kind of worker that we are. This is what it means to be a Christian, to have a holistic worldview that shapes everything that we do. And I think when we begin to think this way, we avoid the frustration that you're talking about. It's very liberating. Yeah. There's a peace of God in a sense that every single day, how I live my life matters for eternity, for the kingdom. Right. That's when the Christian worldview moves just out of church Sunday morning. And frankly, it's the exception that I've seen of churches that really help carefully teach a worldview and connect what is taught Sunday morning to people's lives and their jobs and their career. Now, of course, churches are challenged. They have 45 minutes. They have limited resources and time. I get that. But that's one of the challenges today. We live in a secular world so committed to compartmentalizing your faith. And yet, Jesus says, I created everything. Faith should affect every single choice that you make. That's empowering to live that way as a Christian.
Have you seen people who have recognized their compartmentalized spirituality or their faith in Christianity and then have made the switch? And what did you see unfold when that happened?
I think I see people just realize that, one, instead of pointing at others to be the Christian experts, oh, my youth pastor will do it. Oh, my pastor will do that. Oh, the missions pastor. People begin to take responsibility in their own life and realize, oh, I could lead a Bible study. I could learn how to have better spiritual conversations. I could learn to just engage people around me more thoughtfully. So it begins to transform the way people live. So rather, if you think about it this way, I saw a study about happiness, and it said that there were 3 levels of of way you think about a job. One is a job, second is a career, third is a vocation. So a job is something you get and you move on. A career is long-term. A vocation is a sense of a calling, a higher, deeper purpose in life. There's actually people that had a vocation that were the most happy about life in sense of a contentment. So when Christians realize, I'm not just going to work to get a paycheck, I'm honoring God through my work. This is an opportunity God has given me, and how can I represent Christ in how I do my job? And what would it look like to help other people come to Christ through my profession? They start to ask these questions and build a worldview. It moves from just having a job or a career to a vocation, which just gives life such a deeper sense of meaning to it.
Well, purpose, right? Now suddenly their purpose is expanded regardless of what their job is. It just adds more meaning to it.
I think that's right.
Yeah, so fascinating. So how important is community in having a Christian faith as far as being a part of a community?
Well, I think we live out based on what we believe. So studies have shown that people who describe themselves as Christians live no differently than people who don't in America. But people who describe themselves as Christians and have a Christian worldview, who think like Jesus, are more likely to live like Jesus. But worldviews are always best learned in community, in relationship, with one another. So it's not a coincidence that Jesus would break bread with somebody and share stories, talk with that person, share their life. So the only way we can pass on our values to the next generation is in relationship with parents, with grandparents, with uncles, with coaches, with teachers. And this is something that's not accidental to Christianity. This is at the heart of it. God himself is tri-personal, right? When we're invited to become a Christian, we're in a sense invited into the community of the one God who eternally exists as 3 persons. We're made in God's image to be in relationship with each other, to be in relationship with God. And it's that community that gives us meaning. It's community that gives us purpose. And it's a community where we learn the certain truths that can set us free to go live out our faith in the world.
It's sort of a difference between saying this is an abstraction in my mind as compared to saying it's a living experience, day to day. And I'd imagine that, when things are great, that's one thing, but when life gets tough or there's tragedy, having that community is something that is essential.
I think it's community, and I think it's our belief system. It's both. So sometimes people just say, well, in the Christian faith, we just need community. We got to show we have a great community, invite the world into it. Then there's other people say, no, we just need to preach and proclaim truth. I think it's both. In one of his letters to the Thessalonians, Paul says, I not only gave you the gospel, but my very own life. It's both.
Yeah.
When people look in our broken world and see a loving, genuine, not perfect, but a real community of people, that is so appealing and powerful. But non-Christians can have community. What sets our community apart is there's the Holy Spirit that's there. We have a common brotherhood, and we have truth. So when people are suffering, yes, it's community that helps them, but it's also their belief system. I saw a study by Dennis Prager in his book, Happiness is a Serious Problem, and he saw people that had suffered the loss, married couples that had suffered the loss of a child prematurely. Most of them were either divorced or separated. Just the pain of that would rip relationships apart. And he asked the question, why would some couples be able to stay together and some couples couldn't? And his conclusion was if they had a belief system in place that could make sense of such a tragedy, they were far more likely to withstand the pain and the hurt that comes from the loss of a child. So suffering and evil, for somebody to withstand it, has to have a framework, has to have a worldview, a belief system that doesn't make the pain go away, but at least understand God is with me. God can redeem this for good. We live in a broken world. And community together, I think, is the recipe to help people keep a lasting faith.
I think that's a profound thought, the idea of people having a similar worldview or sense of life. And I think also with what you're saying, and it kind of ties back into our earlier conversation, having the belief is one thing, but having confidence in the belief is another thing. And that's where, because what happens is without the confidence, you say, well, I have the belief, but then tragedy happens, and if it's weak, then the belief probably isn't serving you like it should, as compared to saying, I have confidence in the belief, so when adversity comes, I have a foundation, to be able to process it.
I think that's a great way to put it. So think about it this way. There's a difference between knowing that something is true and knowing that you know that it is true. There's a huge difference.
Yeah.
So I might have students who know a right answer on the test, but they haven't studied. So they know it, but they don't know that they know it, so they don't have the confidence, so they'll second guess themselves and sometimes get it wrong. But if you've studied, you not only know it, you know that you know it, so with confidence you put the right answer down. Our churches are filled with people who know the truth, but it's exception to find someone who knows the truth, but who also knows that he or she knows the truth. Brings confidence not only in suffering, but a willing to share their faith, a willing to live out this faith in the world and all the challenges that it brings. That's why training in apologetics, training in theology is so important, because it helps us not only know truth, but in our minds we can know that what we know is true. And that brings real conviction.
Wow. So you've obviously you're extraordinarily gifted communicator and thinker, and you've chosen teaching as a central part of what you do. What do the next 10 years look like for you?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. Well, I'm going to take 3 months off to coach my son's JV basketball team.
Awesome.
That's
now you're a college basketball player yourself.
I was in the past, not anymore. Yeah. That's for sure. I'm busy. I have a lot of great opportunities. But one of the things that has been in my mind is you know what you love by what you're willing to sacrifice for it, right? What we're willing to really sacrifice for shows what we love. I have some neat writing, speaking opportunities, and I believe God has gifted me with that. My wife's behind me saying, go use those things for the kingdom. Right. But I've got young kids, and I don't want to miss out on that window that I have with them. So I've got some book projects I want to work on. I want to keep teaching. Biola's an amazing place. God has wired me to teach. I read a book and I come in and I'm like, honey, and my son, I explain stuff. They're like, Dad, we're watching TV. It's just the way God has wired me. Right. So I want to keep doing those things, speaking, teaching, have a YouTube channel and blogging. I mean, those things are all fun. But also over the next 10 years, I want to be a good dad and I want to be a good husband.
What's the biggest challenge Christianity faces right now?
I would say probably the shift from people. So let me take a step back. My dad's spoken on 1,200 university campuses. And when he started in the 60s and 70s, people would say, well, give me some evidence. That's not true. Prove it. Right. People don't say that as much anymore, although some people do. They'll say, what right do you have to say that? That's hurtful because we've shifted from seeing even truth being something objectively out there that we can form our life to being whatever I feel is true for me is true. In fact, now I think just in the past few years, we have seen the first time we've seen in culture where even feelings trump science. Even feelings trump science. So to me, at the heart of our culture is, if you define for yourself, as Justice Anthony Kennedy said, he said essentially, you get to define your own meaning and concept of existence in life. We live in such a radical, individualistic, and relativistic culture that says, as long as you believe something, you feel it's right and live it out, you're free, and that's true, go do it. Anybody who says differently is a bigot. Christianity comes along and says, actually, true freedom is found and not based upon living just according to your feelings. True freedom is found in living according to your design as God has made you to be. True freedom is found in submitting yourself to God's desires. True freedom is found in doing the right thing. So there's this cultural move radically towards the individual that's defining freedom in the way that is contrary to the way Christianity describes it. And I think deep in their hearts, people know that this is actually mistaken, but they don't reflect upon it. So I wrote a blog recently on Star Wars. And if you notice in the Star Wars films, there's this underlying theme that you're only free when you submit to an authority and you're obedient. So Luke can only be free when he submits to Yoda. Rey can only be free in the more recent Star Wars when she stops resisting the Force but aligns herself with an objective truth outside of herself.
And I think saying objective truth, because it's not a blind submission.
It's
You're
not.
saying there's an objective truth, and now if you draw that conclusion, you submit to saying, okay, I surrender to this because this is the truth.
Yes, it's not blind faith.
Right.
It's reasonable, but it goes so contrary to this deep-seated belief. When I ask young people, how do you define freedom? They'll say, doing whatever you want to do. So in terms of challenges for people to understand Christianity, it's this individualistic, feeling-based culture where our world is moving towards, rather than understanding, no, true freedom, like David says in the Psalms, I delight in the law of the Lord. Moses says in Deuteronomy 10, here's the commandments God has given you for your own good.
So it's interesting because what you're describing basically is relativism, right? I mean, basically, your truth is your truth is your truth, and you just can be a whim worshiper based on that. You feel this way today, you feel that way tomorrow, and you start to, rather than worship something foundational, it's about whims and how you feel in the range of a moment. And I think that's a challenge to humanity in general, independent of a particular faith. It's kind of a disintegration of any discipline around life that can move it in any kind of a positive direction. So I think that's a very profound observation, and something that I think needs to be corrected in our culture, because it's got a lot of ripple effects that I think lead to bad places.
Well, I think you're right about that. I don't know how to fix it.
Yeah.
G.K. Chesterton said, even at the turn of the last century, he said, look, you can free a camel from the zoo, but don't free a camel from its hump. Don't free a tiger from its stripes. Right. We're only free when we act in accordance with the way we're designed to be, right. When we live our life in accordance with reality. If God exists and he's made us in his image and he's designed this world, then we are only free when we live the way God has designed them to live. Right. So for young people to see that truth is just so contrary to all the voices in our culture that are increasingly proclaiming a different message.
Yeah. It reminds me of a quote from Rand. She said, in order for nature to be commanded, it must be obeyed. And I think it's just alignment, right? So that's a very, I think, powerful insight. So, for people now that are observing this as kind of a final note for them, what message do you want to send them off with from this conversation?
Well, I guess I'd say to people that God is good. And even in our world today, all the messages that we hear is that Christianity's caused all these problems in the past and Christians are bigoted. Well, Christianity has caused some problems and some Christians are bigoted. I'm not going to deny that. But if you understand who God is, if you understand who Jesus is, it's only in relationship to him that we have true freedom. We are made to love God and to love other people. Anything else we try to do in our life is going to end up leaving us empty. It's only meaningful. Jesus said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." But this isn't a blind faith. This is actually a reasoned-based faith and belief system. That's what sets Christianity apart. That Jesus died, was buried, on the third day rose again. And we have consistent early testimony that this historical message is true. And the first people who saw it were all willing to suffer and die for that belief. That's powerful.
I should say, our quest here is to look at the history, the evidence, and the inspiration. I think you've attended to all three beautifully. So thank you so much for your time.
You're too kind. Thanks for having me.